Firstly, yes, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's session, everyone. And I'm really so excited. We were just saying it's so great that we could make this happen. I mean, Niranjan, basically, ever since I listened, I think, I was doing your book launch when I listened to your reading from your book and was in December. I believe I was hoping to somehow bring it to Sasnet, and it happened today. And I would already like to thank both of you for making the time, Niranjan for agreeing, and then also for inviting Debanuj and Debanuj for joining us. And thank you so much, and thank you for letting us be part of this conversation, which is essentially a conversation between two friends. As a note for people in the audience that might not be aware, Niranjan recently published his book Between Queens and the Cities, which we'll hear a bit from very soon. And I've read it. It's not just an amazing book, it's also really a milestone in Nepali literature, as it is Nepal's very first queer memoir. And yes, while this event is not exclusively about the book, I still want to highly recommend it. It's so beautifully written, and congratulations again, Niranjan. We'll hear a bit more about that in a sec. But before we get right into it, I'd like to say a few more things about logistics. This event today is hosted by Sasnet. We are the Swedish South Asian Studies Network based at Lund University. And the event is also co-hosted by the Center for LGBTQ Studies with its home at the Graduate Center of the City University in New York. And for more information about both our organizations, feel free to visit our websites, sasnet.lu.sa and clags.org, or follow us on social media. And in terms of how today's event is structured, we will start off with a short reading by Niranjan from his book, and then we will move on to a conversation between Niranjan and Debanuj. And after that, we'll have time for a question and answer session with the audience. And you as the audience, feel free to already post your questions in the Q&A section here on the bottom of the Zoom window during the conversation between our two speakers, or you can of course also wait until we actually start the Q&A. Yes, and also this event is recorded currently, and it will soon be uploaded to the Sasnet YouTube channel, where you can rewatch it, of course, and share it with people who might be interested. And yes, before we get really started, I'd just like to say a few more words about our speakers. Firstly, Debanuj Dasgupta. He is the board co-chair of the Center for LGBTQ Studies, CLAGS, and also an assistant professor of Feminist Studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And his research and teaching focus on racialized regulation of space, global governance of migration, sexuality, and HIV. And prior to his PhD, Debanuj worked for over 16 years with several international development agencies on HIV and AIDS and LGBT issues, as well as immigrant rights organizations in India and the US. And Niranjan is a writer, education consultant, and assistant director of the Kathmandu-based journal Lalit. And his first book, which I already mentioned, Between Queens and the Cities, I actually also have it here, beautiful, was published by Fine Print Books in 2020. Niranjan received his education or his master's from the City Universities in New York in 2008, and also worked in the States for many years before he returned to Nepal. And now in his writing, he focuses on contemporary art, queer issues, literature, and his work has been published in many different magazines, newspapers, etc. And with that being said, Niranjan, I'd like to pass the virtual mic to you. And please feel free to get started with your reading.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for making this happen and giving us this space. And thank you to Sasnet and for CLAGS for co-sponsoring this event. And special thanks to Debanuj. We crossed paths a few times in New York, clubs, dancing, but then we hadn't really formed a friendship. But many years later, I think in 2018, we ran into each other in Kathmandu. And since then, we've been friendly. I won't say a lot more because I wanted to start by reading with a short reading from the book, and then we'll get more into the context etc. So this is from the very last section. The Laramie project 10 years later ran at the Nepal Tourism Board in May 2017. Other than directing, Bert handled various aspects of production. We met in early spring at the rooftop of Busy Beans, a local eatery, to discuss an educational outreach program. Soon after, we went to the central office of the BDS in Dhumbarai, the BDS being the Blue Diamond Society. Bert had adapted the original script written by Moses Kaufman and incorporated personal narratives of Nepali LGBTIQ individuals. For the BDS meeting, our agenda was to involve the organization in the casting, as well as in the education program. We invited BDS community members to act in the play and also participate in post-viewing discussion sessions at various schools and colleges. Over the following weeks, I corresponded with Manisha Dhakal via email. That spring, 12 Nepalis who identified as either lesbian, gay, transgender, or intersex participated in a total of 6 post-viewing discussion sessions with students who came to see the play. I was pleased at the opportunity to finally work closely through the BDS, and I was awed by stories of struggles and successes, by personal and professional achievements shared during the discussions. The experience was uplifting as well as humbling, a reminder that I have been fortunate and have had it easier. However, awareness alone is not enough when it comes to handling one's emotions. For instance, despite my involvement with the play, and despite the fact that Alok Ved Menon was coming to town, I was feeling sad on a Saturday morning in May. Based in New York City, Alok identifies as a trans writer, entertainer, and performance artist. I had read about their work and also followed them on social media. They, Alok prefers the pronoun they over him, her, were invited by Sonika and Ranup's company for some interactive sessions with the public. They would perform at a ticketed event, give a lecture at a college, and conduct a workshop with a smaller group. An email blurb sent by them described the workshop. What would it mean to create a world where feelings are considered as real and gender is not? With an emphasis on trauma, sexuality, legacy, embodiment, and gender, we will work together to create art that is both meaningful and impactful. The workshop was scheduled for that particular Saturday afternoon, but I had spent Friday evening moping alone after an argument with my mother. The dejection clouded my enthusiasm about Alok's workshop. I had to pull myself together. Around noon on Saturday, I rode my cycle to a small Korean eatery down the street and bought a mixed roll. After a quick lunch, I reached the venue right on time. Alok was sitting in a corner wearing black shorts. The hair was long and curly. I went over to say hello and settled into a seat. Alok started the workshop by listing 3 reminders. Be weird, you have a body, and no misogyny. Earrings dangled from both their ears. They wore a light orange sleeveless vest and bright lipstick. Several bracelets circled both arms. The thick socks and sandals gave a very casual look. As I listened to Alok, as I followed their hands and watched them move, I felt my sadness lift and evaporate. So joyous it was to see them speak, so freeing to witness such courage. Trauma seeps through generations, Alok said. Trauma is real, gender is not. They conveyed grave issues with uncanny humor, as if their humor and talent were exactly what I needed that moment. Antidotes to my pent-up emotions. After an icebreaker game, Alok talked about poetry and how the medium has helped them spread awareness against transphobia, other than helping them express rage and grief. At one point, I managed to record a short clip on my phone and upload it on Instagram. It had Alok with their signature feminine gestures, hands flying in front, announcing, "I don't make poetry to make art, bitch. I make poetry because I want to end oppression today." For the final part of the workshop, they made us jot down a response to the question, what part of yourself did you have to destroy in order to survive in this world? Alok also directed a question to everyone. How are you feeling? And what is one thing that you need right now? I answered, I'm feeling really happy and I need to spend more time with you. Then I surprised myself. So after this, I get fortunate enough to hang out with Alok at a little get together at my place. And then I'm going to speak a little bit ahead. Alok was scheduled to deliver a lecture at Thames College the following afternoon. Initially, Dinesh was supposed to moderate a conversation, but I ended up at the podium introducing Alok using text from their blurb. What is gender? Recent contributions of gender non-binary and gender non-conforming activists and scholars have fundamentally challenged the usefulness of gender as a concept. Is the goal simply equal rights for women, or is it about challenging the very category of woman and man to begin with? At several points during Alok's talk, I laughed loudly, clapping my hands with glee. After the lecture, members from the BDS, including President Pinky Gurung, joined Alok on stage for a brief panel discussion. In response to a question regarding society's changing perception towards LGBTIQ people in Nepal, Pinky said, "There are 4 kinds of people in this world. The first kind innately understands diverse sexualities. They don't have problems with it. The second kind innately thinks that the concept of diverse sexualities is wrong. The third kind understands but pretends that they don't understand. And the fourth kind simply does not want to understand." That categorization was my primary takeaway from the event at Thames. I'm going to end there and let Debanuj, I pass the mic to you for now.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Thank you. That was a wonderful glimpse from your novel. For some reason, you're frozen on my screen, just like you're frozen in my memory. Can you hear me? Okay. So when Niranjan, Hannah, can you guys hear me? Because Niranjan is frozen on my screen.
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, thank you. So when, thank you Niranjan for asking me and Hannah for asking me to be a part of this conversation. It's such a pleasure. And as you were reading, many of the friends from Kathmandu come to my mind, Pinky and Manisha, and friends from Blue Diamond Society, and Alok. So it's like we have a shared world, social across multiple spaces. And so it's wonderful to sort of have met in New York. I remember one of my first memories of you was at the LGBT Center at a South Asian Lesbian Gay Association support group, Salga support group, which was very extremely dominated by the Indian diaspora. I think most South Asian spaces are dominated by Indian scholars, Indian diaspora. So I very humbly join you this conversation today. And then, of course, dancing on the Cholet Party dance floors in New York, to seeing each other over momos in Kathmandu so many years later. But I wanted to talk a little bit like how the portion that you read from your memoir, what it sort of, gestures me towards. So of course, I wanted to flag that I identify, my sexuality is gay, my gender identity is gender queer, and that this is a conversation between predominantly 2 male-bodied persons, right? Your memoir is that of a male-bodied person. So this is not everybody's experience, queer experience from Nepal. And I am an interlocutor who's an Indian academic who's doing work in Nepal. So I just wanted to sort of say that and humbly join this conversation. And everything that I have learned about Nepal and trans queer activism in Nepal is through my friendship with many of you. So, and much like this talk, it's really, I honor friendship as a method and a way of being on this planet. So for me, Niranjan, what strikes me about the portion that you read is Laramie Project is a play would circulate. I'm not surprised that it would circulate and that it would come to Nepal, and this was probably 2010, but you were talking about the Laramie Project being in?
No, so there were two editions. The first one was put up in 2014, and this was a follow-up in 2017, which is part of their format. So only 3-4
Right.
years ago.
3-4 years ago, and whereas Matthew Shepard's murder happened in 1999, right? So, I mean, sort of 15 years or almost 20 years down the lane, that kind of affect that Matthew Shepard's sort of murder was able to garner, this very cute white gay man's murder. Nobody should be murdered. It was not brutally like that. Was able to garner, and then it comes to Nepal. It's not a surprise for me because the spaces you and I inhabit is framed through these kinds of transnational, international development funding, transnational movement of bodies, right? And then what does it even mean for those, school-going students to sort of see something about the United States, even though with Nepali stories in their context, right? And so I think it signals for me a very much a kind of sexuality and trans politics that has also entrenched itself in South Asia. Because of international development funding world, that we have this form of gay and lesbian, for lack of a better word, international capital that sort of funds these kinds of transnational projects. And for me, I can critique that as sort of bringing a different sort of a Western culture, a Western lens, and transplanting that into the Indian or Nepali context. But I always think of this scholar Rafael de la Dehesa, who's written about Mexico and Brazil, Queering the Public, this book about political participation of LGBT people in Mexico and Brazil. And de la Dehesa always talks about we have to pay attention about how people in their everyday lives, quote unquote, local activists, maneuver these spaces, what meaning they make of these spaces. So I don't want to take away the agency of Blue Diamond Society director or members who maneuver the world of international funding, but make something else with it at the same time. Much like the scene that you read for us from our memoir, I wanted to talk about the first time I got reunited with you in Kathmandu. That was summer 2018. And I was there on a Social Science Research Council funded project. My project was looking at the scales of legal recognition of transgender, Koti, Hijra, Methi communities throughout South Asia, because laws have been changing. And as one of the sort of moments, I came for gay pride, for queer pride. I think it's called LGBT pride. And it happens on the day of Gai Jatra. And now perhaps we can talk a little later that there are more than one pride parades in Kathmandu. That it happens during Gai Jatra day. And I remember coming to Tamil, walking through a very touristy sort of district of Kathmandu. And, because I was coming for research and I had known Manisha through some of my friends who have worked for BTS. And I was asked to be one of the flag bearers of the Diamond Society, and eventually one of the flag bearers of the rainbow flag. And the other two people who were next to me was the vice ambassador for the US and the country of UNDP, right? None of us spoke Nepali. None of us knew or could make out why so many Kotis, Metis, trans people were there. They couldn't communicate with us. And I truly had that white anthropologist moment, I don't know how to communicate and I am here. And so I just went with the people who I could speak with in English or Hindi, right? And I ran into a volunteer who was volunteering for a church-based organization. She was traveling from the UK, and she said, "Oh, we're going to this cafe." And we go to this cafe, the Malan Java Cafe in Darbar Square, and that's when I see you, right? So for me, it was very evident that that Pride Parade means something else for me, for the vice ambassador, or for an English-speaking person, and something else for the Gopis and the Métis whom the Diamond Society like brought in buses, right? Years later, 2 years later, or a year and a half later, over dinner at the US ambassador's house, the founder, Sulima Bipant, was telling the story of why they did that, why they planned the Gay Pride Parade to happen on Gai Jatra. Because one of the gay men was dying of HIV related complications. This is way back. And none of the priests at the Shivati temple at the Ghats offered to do his last rites. And so the friends got together and did his last rites. And so when they were thinking of which day to choose to have a pride parade, they said, why not Gai Jatra, which is, if you can, fill us in, it's also like the day where you remember the recently passed dead people, right? So I thought that was a very interesting take specific to the life world of Nepali activists, of picking the day of Gai Jatra to be the day of Pride Parade, like through the invocation to death, some sort of like queer horizon is being planned in Nepal. And so one thing I've talked a lot, but one thing I will stop by saying, and then we can have a little bit more conversation, is for me, it is very interesting that something like the Laramie Project, the story of Matthew Shepard, with stories of Nepali folks inserted in it, can take this kind of transnational, proportion, whereas the everyday deaths and violences that is faced by so many Kotis and Métis. I've worked in Hetauda, in Rotahat, and many of the BDS members, trans women who are doing irregular work and sex work, face everyday violence, from rape, beatings, to both of us know this, horrific death that happened in 2019. I wish the day where their lives are memorialized and their life stories are performed in New York, that we have a queer politics that is defined by their life, not the other way around. And I think what is unique somewhat in my ethnography with Blue Diamond Society and in Nepal is that the legal work that happened in Nepal was very unique. Nobody ever, my students in the US are surprised that way back in 2007, the Nepali Supreme Court gave a decision in support of LGBT rights, in support of violence against trans women, right? That in 2015, the Constituent Assembly of Nepal adopts a new constitution, and constitutional rights for gender and sexual minority are written in it, right? So I think it is very specific to the life world, politics, and intellectual life of Nepal that we have to think about, and that your novel gestures us towards. You talk about belonging and friendship, and there's a lot of juicy details about your love life in the novel. So, I'm trying to sell your novel, but your memoir. So there's a lot there. But, I think your memoir sort of brings some of these layers out very clearly. So I am curious what you also think. So sort of what is sort of, and in the international funding world, sort of the international gay and lesbian funding world, Nepal is often set up as this, sort of pioneering sort of story for Asia, right? Whereas we all know at the same time there is everyday violences, there's class and caste hierarchy. Nobody seems wanting to be talked about caste and ethnicity in sort of the NGO world in Nepal as much. But caste is the sort of the grammar of the land, right? So there is all of that. But for me, the most poignant thing about your memoir is that it felt I could connect with it as someone, who moved away, I came out in India in Kolkata, and I founded the first gay and lesbian support group and HIV/AIDS prevention program. I moved away and I come back again. I mean, I'm actually speaking to all of you from Kolkata today because I've been here for a while, taking care of my family. So there is a lot of that saga, that sort of back and forth. And many of the sort of, BDS community members that I have worked with, they live very transnational lives, but at a very different scale and class, right? They're crossing over to Bihar, they're going for surgeries to Singapore or India. So I just wanted to flag some of those themes that I found unique to your journey, that resonates with my work and my life.
Thank you, Debanuj. I think this context was quite important. Before responding, just like you, I also want to acknowledge the fact that my activism in a way is focused more on on my writing, but even more than that, through my education work. And even the word activism, I'm not as comfortable because, as an educator, and that section in the Larian project I read was a perfect example because, the opportunity arose and to engage students and sensitize students to different issues, But I don't consider myself an activist in the sense, the way Blue Diamond Society people work, or even some of the younger people are very actively raising certain issues. So just to acknowledge that there's a lot of other individuals who have done a lot of very important work in Nepal in the last 2 decades, and even more and more. I mean, even a lot of feminist organizations and groups. So my work is not really aligns with that, but I also really want to acknowledge their work and appreciate that. And my journey, apart from my personal journey in the memoir, has also been just understanding Nepal's movement in the last 2 decades. Like when the Blue Diamond Society was, it was coincidentally started right when my memoir starts, which was when I left for the US. So I wasn't here in the first decade of Blue Diamond Society, which is when a lot of really important and groundbreaking work happened. And a lot of credit to the founding members of Blue Diamond Society. And after I returned, there's always this hesitation to engage. Like I was still sort of struggling with, coming out to my own parents, readjusting back to Nepal. And now I feel that even I had not understood some of the nuances. But very recently, just like you had an opportunity to have an audience with Sunil Babu Pant, I recently spent quite a bit of time with him. He's now become a monk and he goes by, Vichu Kashyap, Bante Kashyap. But he was very kind enough to have a conversation with me as part of Nepal Literature Festival organized by Fine Print this past December, at the end of December. And I really want to acknowledge him and his leadership in creating all of that. And I'm going to pick up on the Gai Jatra example you gave, because I feel like a lot of the things that happened was also symbolic, was also very strategic. And what you shared about Gai Jatra now is, again, news to me, because I feel like there's always so much to learn. But I think, it's important to highlight the point that how did Nepal make such tremendous legal gains, but at the same time acknowledge that maybe the society is not there yet, even now. There's still a lot of violence, discrimination, and again, a lot of misconceptions around terms, around identity labels.
And misogyny, there's a lot of misogyny. Like when you were saying, Alok said, be weird, you have a body, misogyny. There's a lot of misogyny on the streets. Here as well. But sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, definitely. But what I was going to say is very recently when I spent time with Vichu Kashyap, who used to be known as Sunil Babu Pant, I had an opportunity to really learn about his work and some of the decisions he took, strategies. And for now, just to say very quickly that I think he was very sort of attuned enough with the Nepali government, which is again very much dominated by the historically privileged group. It's very dominated by men, but also a lot of quote unquote high caste men, a very Brahminical patriarchal structure, right? So to sort of convince them or to sort of pass certain rules, whether you call it strategic or more genuine, he really referred and studied our ancient cultural trends and sort of knowledge from that. I mean, Gai Jatra being one example where, it's okay, it's actually a festival to honor dead people, and every family has somebody who has died. And he connected that with the transgender person who's died. And that's just a very small symbolism. But what there's a larger symbolism here where he actually gave me several examples, and since then I've also read some of his recent writings and done a little bit of research. He says that the Eastern religious traditions, knowledge, philosophies, in a way, were more progressive when it came to gender identity. So when you go back and read a lot of even Pali texts and Buddhist texts, Hinduism has a lot of examples. We can see evidence that, like in ancient times, there was an understanding that some people don't fit in the binary male-female category, right? So some people are non-binary, and accordingly, there has been categories created, identities created in very specific indigenous groups, and that indicates that Eastern traditions are more progressive when it comes to gender. For example, Jain religion has 15 categories for different genders. And we know in our indigenous cultures, there's the Maruni tradition, men dressing up as women. In the Tarai, there's the Natua tradition. India has Hijra. So there's already these terms and names that comes historically. I mean, the problem we have to be careful when we bring religion is now, especially Hinduism has become very fundamental. I mean, patriarchy seeped in. There's still a lot of injustice and oppression. So I'm not,
Well, Buddhism as well.
Sorry?
If you want to see Buddhism as well, if you want to see, the most peaceful religion killing people, you would have to just go to Sri Lanka, right? So,
yes, definitely. So it's extremely problematic and oppressive for sure. But again, when we go back really 2,000, 3,000 years before, there is evidence of, understanding and categories. And that's why the term third gender, meaning, it's giving space to non-binary people. So it's not saying, first gender, second, third. And even in the passport, when you say male, female, other, it's not othering anyone who doesn't fit. It's actually making space for more. I actually also had that misconception. I didn't realize. I used to say, oh, I'm not comfortable with third gender. I identify as male, gay male. But after talking to him and after sort of doing some thinking, it seemed that, and this seems like a paradox, when you look at, let's say, some European country passports or Western passports, there's more categories, for gender identification. And even when we think of transgender, it seems progressive. But when we dig deeper, the Western canon, the Western society is still more fixed on labeling and boxing people, like either become male or female. If you don't fit, you better transition and become a female, which in a way is more regressive than third gender. Third gender means it doesn't matter if you're male, female, gay, bi, etc. There's this broader space where different kind of fluidity, multiplicity can exist. So in that sense, the third gender category may be more progressive, but also in line with Eastern philosophies,
Yeah, and also, I mean, in the context of South Asia, I mean, I think Nepal is the only country where you arrive and you fill out your immigration form. It actually has male, female, other. I haven't been able to visit Pakistan yet because of the geopolitics of India, Pakistan. I still have my Indian passport. I'm a permanent resident of the United States. But interesting what you're saying is, uh, in Nepal, my feeling, my observation of having worked, done, and lived and worked there over the last 2 years, off and on, is that the movement, the quote unquote movement, younger people's movement, as well as more established NGOs like Blue Diamond Society, the leadership is predominantly, those with gender diversity. It's not predominantly gay or lesbian English speaking people. It's predominantly trans, queer, koti, methi, gender queer folks, younger folks who identify as gender queer and trans. So, that coming from India was actually very interesting for me, because in India, historically what had happened is it was historically gay men, some lesbians, English-speaking upper class, upper caste, and trans communities, be it Koti, be it Hijras, any of the Jogapas, none of that was talked about, or many of them felt on the fringes of this so-called movement, right? And actually, Deepika Jain and myself, we write about this in a recent article that we published in the Journal of Human Rights, and we talk about the Constitution. We talk about the Supreme Court case from Nepal, because it's one of the also in sort of human rights law, it's one of the first Supreme Court judgments that actually cites the Yogyakarta principles, which Sunil Babu Pant, Bhikkhu, how does he identify now? You said Bhikkhu. Sunil's name now is
Bhikkhu Kashyap.
Bhikkhu Kashyap. So, Sunil was a part of the Yogyakarta principles. And as you understand, that international human rights documents, treaties, standards, especially as something as the Yogyakarta principle, which is the sort of, a document that outlines how to think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when it comes to gender identity and sexual orientation. So these are not legally enforceable sort of standards. It's really up to the sovereign nation, its judiciary and its legislative units to kind of respect or use it, right? So in Nepal's case, Supreme Court's case, it was one of the first Supreme Court cases where they actively cited the Yogyakarta principle when they gave a decision in support of transgender people. They said gender and sexual minorities, right? And even now, like we talked about Pinky, Pinky Gurung, and she's also very politically active, right? She's actively involved in party politics, right? Sunil was a member of the parliament. He was invited by the government to be part of the government, right? So this kind of syncretic relationship between administration, the sovereign state, and LGBT activism is also, Nepal is quite trend-setting in that sense. I don't want to set up Nepal as like this utopic, paradise. We all know there are issues there, but I want to sort of point out certain things that I feel are unique in the context of queer life in Nepal. The other thing is, I think when it comes to the term for gender, I really, as an academic, I really don't have an opinion, because as an academic, my point is to observe and try to understand what people that I'm writing with and about are trying to do with these terms, right? I mean, I tell this to my students, you can be trained in continental philosophy, in social critique, and it's very easy to develop critique of the NGO model. But one has to sort of see, one has to name the hierarchies, one has to sort of name the limits of the sort of international development, NGO, the activism model, but one has to also see what people do with it, right? What does it mean for people, for the actors, for community members, the office, have that space, right? What does it mean to have that wall painting in an otherwise just a regular neighborhood in Kathmandu, right? It's this, I'm thinking about the beautiful wall painting that sort of surrounds it's rainbow flag, the sign of law, many queer trans spaces. What does it mean to have the rainbow flag unfurled in Tamil, right? I mean, do shopkeepers in Tamil know about the rainbow flag, the history of Stonewall? Do the Métis who come to the parade, do they need to know? It doesn't matter. But I think what matters is that the rainbow flag is a colorful thing, and many of them are dressed in amazing colors and dancing and performing their local dances. And for them, it is a matter of gathering fun in Kathmandu. And so something as the rainbow flag can circulate as an empty signifier and can take on different meanings. Terms can circulate, whether gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual. But there is something that in transnational sexuality studies we call creative maneuvering, subjective maneuvering. So Martin Manalansan and Analde Malavik-Cruz published this book many years ago called Queer Globalizations. And they take up this question, what does it mean for these terms to circulate in non-Western countries? LGBTQ, genderqueer. Well, genderqueer comes much later. Is it gay or trans imperialism? To some extent it is, but scholars ask us to also pay attention to what they call subjective mediation, that in the local life world, in different contexts, people are making something else out of it, right? So, and I say this because I know I'm read as a transnational sexuality studies scholar, and my field is often dominated by an over-deterministic critique of international development, NGOs, and I want us to be very cautious about this critique. I want us, because what we are doing is we are reducing people's lives, we're insulting people who actually are making something out of this kind of space. Who am I to come in and deny the pleasure of a Koti or a Métis person who's able to hang out in a BGS office in Hetauda? And for them, I remember in a meeting, one of them telling me, this office is not just my home, it's my temple. As you know, Hetauda, an office means a room, like a tiny room, So I just don't want to sort of reduce this transnational exchange to a critique of international development. But much like you, I thank you for being, for naming your privileges, for situating yourself within a global context. I want to flag something else. I don't want us to forget this theme from your memoir, because what your memoir also does for me as a queer migration studies scholar is your memoir is as much a memoir of return migration, because queer migration is often imagined as, I'm leaving my country of origin and I'm arriving in the new country and living there. And it's always about like the struggles of resettlement, right? Your memoir is as much about return migration, what, you attend to your life. So I just wanted to quickly ask about how was it to come back to Nepal? How was it to write about these days? Having read your memoir, I know there was a lot of struggle and joy at the same time. So I didn't just want to forget that about your memoir as well.
Thank you, Debanuj. I wanted to sort of kind of respond to so many different points you mentioned, but let me just try to do that before getting into your, responding to your final question. I think the comparison between, the Indian activists and the Nepali is very interesting and important. Like, when you said the Indian activists being mostly gay, lesbian, privileged, English speaking, whereas in Nepal, it's more.
That is how it started off predominantly. And now there's a visible national and local trans movement, yes.
So I think that's an important point, because some of it might be, again, strategic with the founders, because, and this ties into what was happening around that time when BDS was formed. Was Nepal was going through a massive political restructuring. They were going through a civil war, and a lot of calls for identity politics, historical oppressions were being called out. So it was a very iconic decade in that sense. So that's why it makes sense to sort of really situate the LGBT movement within the larger movement and demands for equality, freedom, and, and I'm talking about everything like caste.
That lawsuit just intervened. And just to intervene, the lawsuit in 2007 was strategically planned because of that. Because the woman question, the ethnic question, was being taken up right into the constitution, and they made a move to make that lawsuit at that moment to insert again a clear trans voice in this moment. Yeah.
Exactly, and I think even the terms, the conceptualization of BDS, actually, the third gender term was also. They came up with it with a very large and wide, consultation with especially minority groups and those who've been very oppressed historically. So I'm talking about those who can't speak, are not fluent in English, hasn't had access, to education system, mostly grew out of Kathmandu, caste based minorities, women, transgender groups, and a lot of ethnic indigenous groups, right? So, and that's when they sort of also, brought their knowledge about the ancient traditions that I mentioned earlier, about the Maruni tradition, Natua tradition, etc. So they all agreed to come up with the third gender term. And that's why I just want to comment very quickly that it's sad to see right now that transference of knowledge hasn't been quite there, and as a result there are misconceptions around the term third gender. A scholar recently mentioned about how it happens across the world, where between generations there's a lack of remembering and connections between generations. I mean, there's a failure in keeping and documenting. So I see this fragment between the two groups, the mutual distrust, insecurities, and as a result they are now re-questioning everything that the BDS achieved. At the same time, I think BDS, as it happens after, a long time, after, establishing themselves, maybe not being as creative and open towards new ideas, new voices, etc. So anyway, that's going on. And you mentioned how maybe terms are also fluid, maybe not as important as the larger issue of just equality, providing dignity, accepting people's differences. But I'm sort of harping on the terms because that's become very sensitive in Nepal's activist circle, whether it's queer or third gender or transgender or Métis, and because of that misunderstanding, there's a lot of antagonism and people not being able to work together, which is sad. Like, I wish, especially as an educator, there were ways to heal that bridge. Regarding, yes, the transnational global funding network, has done a lot of work around these issues. I think to that end, again, there should be a conception of human rights and basic standards that transcends cultures and borders, right? Like, everyone should have like a basic, we should come together and agree to the basic standards. And so in that sense, cultures, traditions may not matter. People need to be treated equally. But then I did mention the paradox in maybe South Asian Eastern cultures where, you know, um, the Eastern culture being more communal, more duty bound, the Western cultures being more individualistic, capitalist, independent based, and hence we can't quite imitate or replicate, movements from the West directly to the East. I mean, at least I am at this point very curious and sensitive to the conflicts and, and I mean, there must be more that we can glean from our past and, to address and make the movement richer, basically, make the discourse richer, I'm personally interested in that. You asked a little bit about my memoir, my journey of returning, and somebody in the audience has also asked about the journey from writing to publishing. What does it look like, and what advice would I give to those who are planning on writing their memoir? Again, I think when it comes to writing, it's again, I mean, we talked a lot about, the BDS movement, Nepal's political, socio-political sphere, etc. But I think I'm primarily a writer and an educator, and a lot of the, composing the memoir is about the writing process. And I think a quick advice would be, it's a lot about just practice, and your intentions and commitments. So there's really no shortcuts. I mean, the more you write, the more you practice, the more you share, the more you read. That's the only way to do it. And regarding publishing, I mean, again, in Nepal, and Nepal is also specific in the sense that we were never colonized the way India was and so many other countries in South Asia. So we don't have that longer legacy of English. So it's really our generation in a way that really sort of came to age with some kind of English education. I mean, people from our parents' generation, a lot of them don't even have access to education, not to mention the oppressive political regimes that actively banned education, So as a result of that, access to English and writing in English is still a much smaller sphere in Nepal compared to even India. Nepali readership is much more. So it's difficult to publish in English and to think about who might read it. I mean, not many people will even read it. Who am I writing for? I mean, I really did it for my own sake, and a little bit for the issue too, to engage people. And I want to thank Fine Print for, they wanted to risk publishing in English, and also believed in me. So, so to that end, I was fortunate. But I think for aspiring writers to just keep trying. So Debanuj, there's another question. Did you want to, should I respond to that, or do you have any comment?
Sure, if we are formally doing Q&A, we can go any way, we can pick questions. So there's this question about religious tradition or discrimination, or is it intertwined with capitalist system that structured the state repression as well? I think that the state, as we think of it, the state institutions, government, and this idea of a state that collects taxes, redistributes, rules, administers, is there to cover over certain fundamental violences in society, right? It's there to cover over, class-based oppression, caste-based oppression, Brahminism. So there is a lot of that, and at the same time, the state has potentials. The state is what we do with the state, So there is engagement, there is pushing the state to pass, these kinds of recognition-related laws that amend or change previous oppressions, but then the state also covers over fundamentally certain kinds of oppression. And so I think when it comes to the question of gender and sexual relations, that it is both I mean, I think communism wasn't too kind to queer people and their women workers as well, and did propagate, the family as a unit of consumption or as a unit of worker. It's central to either of the systems, capitalism and communism, right? Although many communist groups later on took up the question of homosexuality, and have actively written manifestos about LGBT rights. But I mean, I do think that capitalism as a system, takes up any form of social difference, and uses it for profit, right? So, and I want to flag that. I mean, I think in the so-called LGBTQ movement, that we must remember that the market has historically and is willing to give us equality even when the state hasn't, right? So you can buy your transgender specific clothes or, gay male specific wares and flags and pins, on the internet or for specific companies, or go on your gay tourisms, and so the market works with us, to kind of give, to say, well, I'm here, it's cool, buy your gay products, open your gay industries, whether or not the state does. So I think we have to also think how consumption is very sort of central to an imagination of a gay and lesbian life, and even a trans life, right? I mean, I think fashion shows and pageants and pageantries, even pride parades where we meet in terms of cafes and restaurants, it's very central. The market is very central organizing unit to this imagined gay, lesbian, trans politics and recognition. I mean, I think, but there is other kinds of exciting work happening, like access to clean drinking water, trans women demanding access to housing and clean drinking water, employment, creating cooperatives, trans farmers in India. So there's a lot of other exciting stuff. And I think it's precisely sort of the bourgeois conversation around gender and sexual relations frames us to only think about recognition from the state. What the hell am I going to do with employment non-discrimination if there's no jobs, right? How does even employment non-discrimination, how does even recognizing third gender people protect a Métis who's crossing the border to do Sadda dance in Bihar, right? And that life is not central to the imagination of a gay and lesbian politics. I mean, forget politics, that life is not central structuring element of a gay and lesbian imagination, right? And I think, so that's what I wanted to flag in relationship to the question around religion, tradition, and capitalism. There is a question that's more specific to Nepal, I think.
So I also want to respond very quickly the influence of capitalism is definitely there, and the Nepali state right now, ironically, is very capitalistic, and historically, it extractive at the expense of marginalized people. There's a crisis in ideology, and also, to your point, what you are saying is, well, if there was creativity with the state, if there was openness, then you could actually tap into the LGBT consumer basis and, like open cafes, LGBT like cafes, and really support the community. But that's completely missing because of lack of imagination and lack of creativity in the political class, But right. Then you also right. pointed at so many other, experiences, diverse experiences, and spaces that's there. The other question has to do with whether there has been, solidarity building between feminists and queer people, and I mean, the constitution now discriminates women. They can't pass the citizenship to their children in the same way as the conversation around gender and sexual minorities started. I mean, not really. And that's another area that needs to be worked on, just building solidarity between different marginalized groups. Another question. I'll just read it aloud. There's a misunderstanding amongst queer activists in Nepal. What are the reasons for these misunderstandings? And can you speak on formation of this dissent within the community? What is the way forward and what does solidarity look like in Nepal? I think the misunderstanding is created and there is a lack of solidarity, in my opinion, primarily because I think in the quote unquote, whether it's the third gender LGBTQ movement, there's a lack of creative leadership. And I feel very strongly that Sunil Babu Pant was an exceptional leader, was able to, achieve monumental gains. And after he left around 2012-13, there hasn't been that kind of leadership. And again, I'm talking about BDS still does a lot of, work around sexual health and basic support. They have massive networks throughout Nepal, a lot of extremely disadvantaged groups get some kind of support through BDS, but maybe, there's a lot more work that needs to be done, a lot more lobbying with the government around, education reforms, more laws, more, all of that is not there. And again, to respond directly to the question is, how will it accommodate new activists who literally were born, who are literally as old as the BDS, a lot of them. And again, there's that distinction and gap where, maybe the younger people haven't had that education or, knowledge about the journey that BDS has taken. And again, the tendency to really absorb information, online information now, social media really being really big, English speaking, access, that kind of approach sort of alienates the older, the BDS constituencies who don't have access to English, who feel easily threatened or are insecure, And again, I don't have a quick answer to that question, how does one build solidarity? But I feel that the more people are able to come together, there needs to be organized discussions, people need to be open and, being suspicious of one another is not going to help the movement. Like, I think people need to actively think about how to take it forward creatively. Like, I don't have a solution to that question. But
no, thanks, Niranjan, and thanks to Pukar for asking the question. Hi, Pukar. I think for me, I think dissent is great because it's important. It's dynamic. It creates tensions, new ideas. I think we don't have to agree on everything. I mean, I don't agree with my mother on anything at all. That's a different story. But I think it's dynamic. It's, difference is amazing because we created a movement because there was we feel different from heteronormative family relations. So, I mean, I think difference has to exist. I mean, I welcome difference because difference is dynamic. If you and I agreed with each other all the time, it would be a very boring life, a very boring movement, New ideas are formed out of negotiating difference. The question is, how do we deal with difference, right? I mean, and I think not all differences have to be resolved. I mean, in India, it's a population of almost 2 billion people. So going by traditional numbers, we have over, 3 million LGBT people. I did math very bad. It's like supposedly 30% of every population is LGBT. Why would one organization or two organizations, how can they even come to represent over 3 million people, right? That's impossible. So, I mean, I think it's important and it's good there is difference. I differ with you over the leadership of BDS. I think the leadership of BDS is very exciting. They know they have found the work they want to do, and they're doing that, right? I think the reason BDS comes across as not doing exciting work is because they don't have a figure as iconic as Sunil Babupan. That's not to take away from the work that Sunil did, but he became a global iconic figure. The Western world could not even fathom, a gay and lesbian activist who's not part of a government in a third world country. For them, this is exotic as hell. So he became an international icon right away and put BDS in Nepal on the map of international sort of dynamic sort of activism. And I think after his exit, the work that is happening is very different, right? I think the difference though is that there is younger set of people, as you have said, or a different generation, who's virally communicating with each other, who's information over Snapchat and Twitter and Instagram flows. My students tell me old people use Facebook, so I'm on Facebook. That tells my age. But information and ideas and images and videos and visions of a different kind of a world are very quickly exchanged over viral media. And I say, Asia, that there is a difference between
Well, let me just clarify, since Debanuj is freezing. I don't mean to say at all that there's no leadership in BDS. I definitely need to acknowledge that they've been doing really great work and a different kind of work. I just mean the crisis in leadership in the sense, there's this growing number of younger activists who are questioning the BDS approach and causing noise on social media. And also there hasn't been a very positive response to that or a way forward. That's what I was trying to say. But as Debanuj rightly pointed out, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem or something is wrong. I think difference being, a sign of healthy discourse in a way, and people don't have to agree. I'm just curious to see how this will go forward. And while we wait for Debanuj, another question related to travel for LGBTQ people in Nepal. I will say that Nepal has mostly and always been very welcoming towards tourists, and our tourism is one of our biggest industries. And so to that end, all kinds of people are very welcoming. And, there hasn't been really, apart from a few cases here and there, which happens everywhere, there isn't active violence against tourists or LGBTQ people. So I would definitely say that, that's another area where we can really, speaking of consumerism and capitalism, whatever, but, we would welcome LGBTQ tourism. It's something that, again, Sunil Babupant had started with Pink Travels, which didn't quite take off, but there's massive potential for that, How are we doing with time, Hannah? Should we maybe move towards wrapping up? Or are there any other?
Yes, the floor is obviously open to questions, so please feel free to go on. I have a few questions myself. We have a few more, maybe 10, 15 minutes left. Yeah, maybe I'll just take it ahead. There was one thing I was wondering when reading the book. You already talked about this migration aspect, and a big part of the book is kind of describing, how the escape from Nepal, and then also exploring, was it really an escape? How is it possible to escape? Now, that can you remind, when was the year that you left Nepal to America first?
99.
Right. That's 20 years ago. It's a really long time ago. Do you think, obviously a lot of things have changed in Kathmandu, some to the worse, but also a lot of things to the better. Would you still, if you were 19 today, would you still leave? Would you still be as, tempted to leave and as eager to kind of escape what the city is right now? Is first part, personal? And then secondly, how important do you think it still is for queer people in general, queer Nepalis in general, to leave the country, to have this type of like escape experience and then come back? Or are we branching more towards like a city, or I mean, now we're talking very Kathmandu focused, right? But like a city that provides spaces where people don't actually have to escape from anymore. Yeah.
Wow, that's a really great question, Hannah. Thank you. The first one, especially, like I hadn't thought about that. If I was 19 today, would I still leave? But again, that question itself comes with so many other related issues, like whether, like I might leave just to pursue higher education because Nepal does not necessarily have, qualitative higher education, although that can also be challenged. Now we have a couple of, more options than there were before. I think being 19, I can't quite imagine, because there's also just, because of your age, just this desire, hunger to explore, go to new places, make new friends, and that question has an even greater meaning now in the, in the COVID, pandemic environment, like where actually so many college kids this past year couldn't even go when they were already accepted, right? So they spend the year taking online classes at US universities. And I think it'd be interesting to ask them, what does that look like? I think the whole global space has slightly shifted and is changing, and travel has taken a new meaning, leaving away. We've rediscovered relationships with family members, rediscovered our own personal spaces, all of that. So I think there's a lot to consider that. And of course, the explosion in online spaces too. Like, I mean, back in 1999, it was very rudimentary. There was only a few chat sites, etc. Now, like with video chatting, with so many other inventions, I don't know if people will still feel the need to go. But that question for me is also it has a lot of very deep personal reasoning too. And as I've mentioned in the book, just relationships at home with parents, etc., needing to get away, all of that, which is different for different people. So that was the first part. What was the second part of your question? Because I was too focused on the first part, I think.
More like, on a more general level, how people, like young queer people now in Kathmandu, how you still think how important it is for them to escape. Should it be important, or is Kathmandu actually slowly offering spaces where you can also kind of find your freedom there?
So the direct answer to that question is, I mean, there's at least one bar now, gay bar, Pink Tiffany's, where I've heard a lot of younger people go to on Friday nights. When I was growing up, that wasn't there. And even that provides space to make connections, like all of that. And that question, like this may not be a direct response, but I feel that, and I haven't really shared this, is one of the primary reasons I wrote this book was, I think people in my generation, like we talked about the slightly older generation and the slightly younger generation, I feel that a lot of people with certain privileges who grew up in Kathmandu, who were queer or gay or lesbian, I think it's somewhat safe to say that they felt that there was no space for us in Nepal or Kathmandu, like including me, that, I felt it very strongly. And this need that the only way I can live the life I wanted was by, leaving and being away. Like I couldn't imagine it in Nepal, for various reasons. And I returned and rediscovered and explored all these spaces, a changed city, a new consciousness. And I really felt that, wow, at least after having that experience, then I feel that for me, there's definitely space and people actually should return. And I think there's a need for people to at least return to back and forth engage. And the circularity is important rather than the message I want to give, at least to people in my generation, is you don't need to feel that there is no space here, or, the only space is by going abroad. A lot of that also comes with your own personal work. I think that's why coming out and talking about it and at least doing some work is important. And there's struggle there. The question is whether people are willing to make that struggle. Are you willing to face it, take risks, Again, that comes with privilege, but I feel that I did some of that and made space for myself. But if people are always hiding and not as courageous, then the change will never happen, and you only have to lead one kind of life. I think, and that creates more stress, more, maybe mental health issues, like more problems. So, the more you face yourself, the more you are able to explore your own selves and your spheres. I think that's healthy for everyone involved. So I hope I answered that question somewhat.
Definitely. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's been around 2 years, I think, since I left Nepal permanently, and I'm mostly connected via Instagram. And there's a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of things, there are a lot of conversations happening. And that's also why I was wondering how promising are new, spaces, platforms, and all for people. And still, I'm mainly focusing on Kathmandu because I actually have no idea what's going on outside of the city. But in Kathmandu, that it seems that a lot of new space is being created, basically. It's my impression.
Yes.
Yeah. Another question would then be what happens outside of Kathmandu, but that's maybe a whole different story.
Yeah. I think outside of Kathmandu would be different places, and it's based on different contexts, right? Like Pokhara would be very different because of its tourism hub and because of where. I mean, I think some of this is how we and where we are, in sort of and what do we see? Because I might not see certain things because I'm looking for open and out people. And so because there are so many ways of living, sort of a non-heteronormative life in South Asia, right? Something that Niranjan mentioned a long time ago. But I do think there are very, like, we don't have to wait for a space to open up, like Pink Tiffany. And I think that is something exciting that is happening, at least in the valley, in Kathmandu Valley, is that people are making a space into a queer space. People just show up, right? And I mean, I think that's what is exciting for me, for the pride that is happening in tandem to like June Pride Month throughout the world, right? So it's clearly a set of people who understand and connect to this sort of history of pride being in June and Stonewall, um, and that is very exciting for me because people, it seems, are not waiting to open up, gay space or a queer space, but are creating spaces for themselves, taking over spaces, and I think that is a difference that I see, and it's very exciting. And also, I don't know how much where I got cut off. There is also the difference between formal and informal LGBT politics. So the way some of these organizations in India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, like Hamsafar Trust or Blue Diamond Society or Equal Grounds opened up was primarily through HIV/AIDS funding, and it was that HIV/AIDS moment in the 90s and early 2000s where there was a lot of funding from that, right? And there still is in Bangladesh and Nepal because these are still considered high-risk countries by and there's global AIDS funding there, So, but I think there is a generation of people now who believe in different kinds of creative politics, sort of don't necessarily associate LGBTQ politics with institutionalized, even feminist politics, with institutionalized NGO politics, professionalized NGO politics. But it is very much around, collectives and coming together, and it's very formal. It gathers and scatters, so it's very rhizomatic, in that sense, and that is the power of this different kind of newer politics, is that it sprouts, and it sprouts here and it sprouts there, and it's virtual, and it's a set of tweets and images, And so it's a very different kind of rhizomatic politics that is happening, right? Rather than something delusive here, rather than being arboretic and thinking of an office, and the office being the center of organizing and that kind of professional NGOized politics. So, and I think that is the difference, and that is exciting about it. This whole conversation is making me want to eat momos. It's making me want to walk through all my favorite areas in the valley in Pokhara and Rotahat or Hitauda. So I'm very sad I couldn't come to Nepal on this work trip. Yeah.
Hopefully soon. Before you get to start romanticizing Nepal, maybe Hannah can relate to that too. Just to answer another question quickly, and we're also maybe close to closing. So strategic plans for, I think it essentially means sensitizing, like what are my plans to sensitize the public around different sexualities, different gender identities, etc. Thank you, Sheila, for asking that question. And just to take this moment that I consider that sort of one of my primary lines of work now, where I've done a couple of workshops around gender and sexuality and sensitizing the public, and working with college students, but even different groups of people to really sort of get them to question and think about traditional gender norms. I do that through different videos, activities, people really making people think and understand that gender is a social construct. Hopefully, when the more this kind of work we do over the years, like I take a long-term view, hopefully there'll be some change. But again, the question is, how can we get the older generation to change their minds and accommodate and accept people's diversity? I mean, to that point, I mean, women are still fighting for equal rights. People, that's still very much the need of the hour in Nepal. The constitution discriminating. There's a lots of discrimination around menstrual hygiene in different parts of the country. Girls are getting raped and murdered. I mean, we have a long way to go when we think about that. But I think all of these should happen in tandem, and people should come together and learn from each other. But the work needs to happen regularly.
Debanuj, would you like to add anything to that? Or great closing words?
No, I think Niranjan did it very well. Although if we have time, I would like to hear more of Niranjan's memoirs. But the only thing I want to say at the end is that there is so much vibrant work that is happening also in the academic world in Nepal. So I'm thinking of Professor Bindu Pokhrel's work. These are women studies scholars at Central University who are great allies. There is so much amazing Dalit, trans, Dalit writing coming out of Nepal on Dalit feminist activism, and that I think we tune into that as well.
Yes, thank you once again, Debanuj and Hannah. I think maybe let's ending with a much shorter reading, and we can just maybe call it.
Fantastic.
This is sort of more poetic and, I would think, and more reflect and more personal, I meant, than the first reading. Each encounter leaves its own ephemeral imprint, like clouds that fleet across the sky. In the United States, I rarely looked up. In Nepal, I learned to appreciate the puffs that change form and hue every day. Sometimes a date with a guy disappoints, causing heaviness, but I meet others who stir pleasant emotions, the way one feels while watching short dashes shimmering on a red evening sky. I have a regular buddy, says he, after he flashes a photo of his 6-month baby. Faceless, spineless, is he lost or is he the one who has found his way? They do very well here, can't you see? It was here that Vishnu once became Mohini. Oh, this is just a phase, they say. What is this thing, being gay? Some give up, some run away. Some are caught in between, they pretend to sway. explorers, travelers, risk takers, they're all here. If only they could explain this to society. So they do this, they go there, they make up stories. Eventually, most choose the easy way. Many ways to be, so many, but in this country, really? Thousands of men, multicolored pain. We're damaged, they yell. God damn it, why did you make me this way? Read books, meet people, the wise ones say. You have no choice, you're just fine being this way. No, 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 you see, there is tremendous difficulty. This is no sin city. Here, everything is holy.
Wow, makes me want to read it again. So nice. Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you.
Again and again.
This was so great. I'm really glad we have a recording of this, because sadly there was some technical error and we couldn't live stream on Facebook, but this recording is going to be put up on YouTube very soon, extra soon, now that we don't have the Facebook live stream. And I really hope that more people can see this, because yeah, great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you.
And for those who couldn't be on Facebook, the YouTube video will be out soon.
Exactly. And thank you to the audience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Take
great.
care.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Good evening. Bye.